And good morning, everybody. I appreciate the willingness of everybody to allow me to do this lecture today virtually. The video will be uploaded to YouTube, and you guys can view it as much as you want. We'll do a quiz review later, so today will just be the lecture. But today's chapter would be Chapter 13 in policing. The topic at hand is use of force. It's something that we've all discussed in class. We've all seen it firsthand. It's definitely something that's very controversial, and therefore something that sells. The media wants you to see that. But the term excessive force is obviously different than your typical use of force that we would have, and that almost all arrests at some point require some degree of force be exerted on that person being arrested. The key is that what is the difference, or what is the boundary between what is excessive and what is normal or appropriate behavior. Excessive force, of course, is something that will be monitored by your internal affairs unit, and something that oftentimes results in officers getting suspended, fired, or even formally prosecuted and tried for battery, assault, or things of that nature. In law enforcement, we use something called the use of force continuum, which can be visualized on page 222 in your textbook. It talks about an actual triangle, if you will, or a pyramid, obviously with the lower portion of it being the less severe form of force, and then of course eventually escalating to the very top, which should be that of deadly force, which should actually be utilizing the officer using his weapon or a gun to shoot an individual and ultimately try to stop the threat. Right, we don't shoot to kill, we shoot to neutralize the threat, but oftentimes deadly force arises. The officer doesn't have that ability to try to save somebody's life. They just have to do what they have to do in that moment. And then of course we open that up to being scrutinized by the public and by your own agency in general. So it's important to understand on page 222, the chart that we're looking at, it talks about mere presence. A lot of times the mere presence of somebody being there, the officer's presence alone is actually a use of force in theory, right? It's keeping people away from actually endangering themselves or society in general by committing crime. You see a police car, you're less likely to commit crime, right? We've talked about that in class. Going out there and initiating traffic stops in an area that may be high risk, if the officer is able to do that, therefore the community is able to see that there's officer presence. That alone is a deterrent, right? It's a form of force. Verbalizing, officers talking to the general public, persuading people to talk. Often said the best tool that an officer has at their disposal is actually their mouth, right? It's how you use your words, what you say to people, getting people to comply. Voluntary compliance is always the best. The book actually talks about a lot of different other topics. I don't want to get too deep in that because I don't feel like it's super important, but just understand that there's a hierarchy that they use in use of force. The officer does not have to use their words before they escalate to use their guns. The officer, if they see fit that they pull a gun, then they don't have to meet any of the criteria below it. They just act off of it. So make sure that you understand that the officer can escalate these steps. He can start with his words. If that doesn't work, then he can try something else. But the officer doesn't necessarily have to. If somebody pulls a gun on the officer, he doesn't have to stand there and say, plead with the subject, please put your hands down, stop doing what you're doing, listen to me. The officer can pull the gun and neutralize the threat if he needs to. We talk about deadly force, of course, which is the ultimate seizure. We've talked about that in class. It's something that I've harped on. I know everybody in here is aware of what that is, but deadly force obviously is any sort of force that's used by the officer that could potentially cause harm to that individual. What we're looking at here is deadly force doesn't necessarily mean a gun. It can be, the officer can use their radio to hit somebody in the head. They can use a flashlight to hit somebody. Oftentimes it is a gun, though. So when we're talking about deadly force, we're specifically talking about a gun being used. The issue with that is it opens the officer up to liability, right? They have internal policy at their agency, and they also have a legal standard based off of the court case of Tennessee versus Garner, which actually looks at reasons of when the officer can actually utilize deadly force. Make sure you guys understand on page 224 the court case of Tennessee versus Gardner and all that implies. It's an important court case. Even in the police academy, you'll have to Make sure that you understand that if you go to that, or if you practice law in law school, you have to understand what that court case is and the precedent that it sets down. Another issue that we've had to deal with often is that of suicide by cop. A lot of times we've been dealing with the fact that people have mental illness, or maybe depression, or maybe they just get so worked up and been out of shape about a certain situation that they're in, that stress causes them to want to commit suicide, but they can't necessarily do it to themselves. So they try to have an officer do it, right? They try to do suicide by cop by pulling a gun on somebody, sticking their hands in their pocket, officers giving them verbal commands to stop, to do what they're asking them to do, and they don't do it. And they pull out something in their hand and say, "I'm going to kill you, I'm going to hurt you," do something like that. They pull it out, they have a cell phone or something in their hand, and the officer shoots the person. Well, the person had a cell phone, but the person has basically done something where the officer thought that they were in fear of receiving harm. So what they've basically done is they've neutralized the threat at hand. Non-deadly force, especially nowadays, we've seen so many different ways that less lethal force can be utilized. The biggest non-deadly force obviously would be, I would consider it to be like a hands approach, putting hands on somebody, trying to neutralize a threat, whether it's some sort of takedown, some sort of training that the person has gone through to allow them to do that. We've also looked at less lethal weapons. Specifically, the taser has become perhaps one of the more commonly used tools of law enforcement's weapon arsenal that they have available to them. The less lethal weapons, of course, can also consist of a less lethal shotgun, which is essentially just a regular shotgun that's capable of firing an actual live shotgun round out of it, but instead it's got an actual beanie bag type thing inside of the cartridge. It looks like a little squid. It's got like a little head that's full of pellets, and then below it it's got like little tentacles, and actually what it does is it hits the subject. It can actually go inside of the subject because it's basically has gunpowder in it, right? And it's a dangerous object, but it's better than actually shooting them with buckshot or birdshot or something of that nature. Typically buckshot, which have been carried by law enforcement. Less lethal is definitely something that's also caused issues in the media. We've seen officers say that they meant to pull their taser, but they've instead pulled their duty weapon and end up shooting somebody. Training, the officer's training, knowledge, experience, education, all those things come into play with that. A lot of times, sometimes situations cannot be avoided, and the officer must utilize some sort of less lethal takedown, if you will. But a lot of times, if a really good officer can de-escalate the situation by just talking to somebody. So we have tasers, we have impact munitions, which are basically like the beanbag rounds that we were talking about, and then of course pepper spray. Pepper spray is an awful thing. It's good for crowd control because it can cover a lot of different people, but oftentimes the officer that's spraying it will actually get on them. So it's actually kind of counterproductive, if you will, is that the officer is now impaired, and their ability, their eyes are watery. It lasts for days. It doesn't just go away. But just be aware that there's different types of less lethal or non-lethal devices out there that exist. But potentially, the most commonly witnessed use of force with a less lethal would definitely be a taser. We talk about physical brutality and obviously brutality that exists by law enforcement. Use of force, it's a very thin line, guys. You think about it, you're sleep deprived, you're hungry, you're stressed out at work, you're stressed out at your job, and what ends up happening is you're placed in a very stressful situation as a police officer, and oftentimes what happens is a physical assault can happen with an assailant. You can be trying to take somebody down in a domestic call or what have you, where you're having to put hands on this person, and if the person's fighting back, clearly all of those factors that I've mentioned, the fact that you're tired, you're sleep deprived, you're hungry, you're irritated, you've already been dealing with calls for service all day that are similar to this, you have very little patience at this point. It's very easy to lose your temper, to get really upset with somebody, and oftentimes that's where officers get in trouble. Their mind is in the right place initially, but then it escalates to something else. It's common sense. Somebody's fighting you and punching you and kicking you and spitting on you and trying to bite you. It's very easy to want to try to inflict pain on them as well, right? It's human nature to do that. it goes against the grain to sit there and allow somebody to be doing that to you, and you be sitting there saying, "Stop resisting, stop resisting." It's just not typical normal behavior. So definitely verbal abuse, can go both sides, right? Officers can say things that are verbally abusive to people, to citizens. People can say things that are verbally abusive to officers. Ultimately, the biggest thing in an officer's favor today, as far as use of force is concerned, are body camera footages. Even today, some of the agencies, especially up in North Georgia and some of these rural areas, they don't have body camera footage. They don't have dash cam footage. All these things are important. Your bigger agencies will have dash cam and body camera footage. Oftentimes, sometimes it catches the officers doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, but a lot of times it prevents them from being attacked by the public and being accused of something. When it's so easy, they can pull up their body camera footage and just show, hey, look, this is what was going on from point A to point B. I literally, from when I step out to the car to when I'm actually engaged with this person in a fist fight or having to arrest them or what have you, that it actually allows them to play that back and you can see kind of what's going on. But once again, thinking that it does not take into consideration the fact that this person's tired, right? That maybe they're getting a divorce, maybe their kids are stressing them out, maybe their family's visiting for the holidays or something, maybe they're not able to go home and have dinner with their families because it's the holidays. None of that stuff is captured on video. So just be aware that there's always more than meets the eye, but definitely body camera footage is something that goes hand in hand with use of force, and is definitely something that you need to be aware of that exists. It's something that definitely needs to be supported in the community. The chapter, guys, is very short. It's not something that's in great detail. It's not something that I'm going to waste your time on. I would like you to do, as far as there's a writing assignment and there's a chapter discussion. I do not want us to do the chapter discussion. I would prefer everybody actually do the writing assignment. And the writing assignment is basically a case study. It says, as the sheriff of your county, you demand that your deputies adhere to a higher standard of policing. You insist that they be ethical and refrain from unnecessary use of force. What can you do to identify deputies who are in violation of your rules? So just give me something. Give me, 5, 6, 7 sentences, something like that basically talks about that. That's sufficient enough to warrant a grade on that assignment. If you have any questions, you guys know you can reach me by email or text, and I'll be sure to go ahead and upload later this week the actual quiz review that you guys can look at. But if you guys have any questions, let me know. And other than that, hopefully this works out well for you guys. And once again, I appreciate your patience and look forward to seeing you guys soon. Thank you.